Today we're going to talk about one of the most significant American sports cars built since World War II. That's a pretty big claim, but I think we can show you why we think that. The car we're going to talk about today not only created a marketplace for cars that exist to this day, but it also kept alive a car that many people to this day love, called the Chevrolet Corvette. The car we're going to talk about today is the 1955 through 1957 Ford two-passenger Thunderbird. This is Steve Bush for Steve Bush Classic Cars. This car debuted in 1955 to much acclaim, which did not make General Motors very happy because they were having a hard time giving away Corvettes. In 1953, they made about 300 Corvettes, and they did give them away to celebrities and people to try to get publicity for the car. They sold maybe 3,500 cars the next year. And then in '55, when Ford came out with the Thunderbird, Corvette sold a whole 700 cars. Well, the Thunderbird sold every car they could make. They sold over 15,000 cars. And they continued to do that for the next 2 years, selling practically everything they could build. And they ended up making close to 50,000 two-passenger birds in 3 years. It took Corvette a decade to build that many cars. The reason why Corvette is here today is because General Motors could not walk away from a market that Ford had so handily dominated. Their corporate ego would not let them walk away from a market that had been created to show that they could not compete. So they doggedly kept on with the Corvette. And it wasn't really until 1963, when they came out with the fantastic Stingray, were they able to sell 17,000 Corvettes in a year and finally eclipse the production records that the Thunderbird had set years before. While Ford sold about 15,000 to 16,000 of these a year for 3 years, they knew the market really was for a bigger car. And so in 1958, they came out with the four-passenger Thunderbirds. And it was a pretty revolutionary car. It was much lower than cars at the time, about 9 inches lower than a standard sedan at about 52.5 inches high. It had a very low ground clearance of less than 6 inches. A lot of cars in those days, people expected them to be able to go down dirt roads and go places. But with the expanding highway system, Ford said, we're going to come up with a car meant to cruise the highway. And the new Ford Thunderbird was that car. It was low to the ground. It was built different. It was a unibody car, which was new for Ford. Most of their other cars were body-on-frame cars. And I can tell you that that low ground clearance of less than 6 inches has particularly meaning to me, because my dad went and bought a 1958 Thunderbird, and it was a great family car. And one day, we were living in Indiana at the time, we were going down a highway, a rather icy road. My mother was driving the car, I was in the right front seat, and we hit a patch of black ice and the car went sideways. The left rear quarter panel hit a post in the middle of the highway. The driver's door flew open and my mom just disappeared from the car as we continued to slide sideways down the center divider. Well, what seemed like a long time, it was probably 25 yards, the car came to a stop. We all looked around and Mom was gone. We didn't know where she was. My dad looked at me and my sister and said, I think your mom's dead. Well, that's the way parents talked to kids in the 50s, you know, they really coddled us. So we got out of the car and we looked down there and there's my mom laying on the ground, all dusty and dirty and mud and snow on her and a little blood here and there. And she was well shaken and very stirred, but she survived it. Had that been another car, it would have passed over her body and killed her. But that Thunderbird, being so low, just pushed her along the ground and just rolled her around like a barrel for about 25 yards. She didn't feel too good for a couple of days after that, but you know, she was alive. So we always liked that '57 Thunderbird. We thought it was a pretty good car. The Ford two-passenger Thunderbird was sold as a personal luxury car. It came with all of the luxury amenities that all of the other Fords had. It had power seats, roll-up windows, a hard and a soft top. The driving position of the Thunderbird was actually copied from the XK120 Jaguar. When Jaguar came out with the XK120, it really stunned the world. It was such a fantastic sports car. And Detroit wanted to get into this business. Several of the Detroit executives owned XK120s and they liked the driving position. So they basically copied the seat, pedal, and steering wheel relationship of the 120 directly into the two-passenger Thunderbird. But as I said, it was marketed as a personal luxury car, but it still had a V8 engine. So Americans being what they are, if you've got a V8, you're going to hot rod it. People started hot rodding Thunderbirds right at the very beginning. Every year at the Daytona Beach, there was a speed trial where the manufacturers would show up and they would do a standing mile run. And in 1955, a man by the name of Chuck Daigh showed up with a 1955 Thunderbird, and Zora Arkus Duntov showed up with a 1955 Corvette. Well, at the end of the day, the Thunderbird beat the Corvette. The only problem is, both of them being hot rodders, they were both disqualified because both of their engines were not stock. So the next day, Chuck came back with a stock 312 V8 engine Thunderbird and set the flying mile record that year at Daytona. And that was the start of his career in racing Thunderbirds. I'd like to talk a little bit about Chuck Daigh. He's one of, as we say, the greatest generation. He joined the 82nd Airborne, and he got to visit Europe from the air and from the ground. Chuck was awarded the Bronze Star, and he was awarded a Purple Heart. Well, after the war, he came back and he picked up his hot rodding ways, and he supported the Lincoln factory race team and racing the Mexican Road Race Series as a mechanic and as a driver. He worked for Lance Rebentlow at Scarab when he had the Scarab Motor Works in California as a mechanic and as their chief driver. He was also hired by Ferrari to drive in the 1959 Sebring 12-hour race, driving a Ferrari TR250 Testarossa, a car which we'll talk about a little bit in a later video. So Chuck was teamed with Dan Gurney in that race, and Phil Hill and Oliver Grendenben, which I can never pronounce his name, might as well call him Green Bean. They were competing for the World Championship of sports cars. So when their car broke, they decided to put them in Chuck and Dan's car. So they had 4 drivers in that car, and that car went on to win Sebring. All 4 drivers were given credit of winning the race. But if it wasn't for Chuck and Dan, the car wouldn't have been there for them to put Phil and the other gentleman in to get the points they needed to try to win the World Championship that year in sports cars. And Dan Gurney really admired Chuck. He said at one time, Chuck was like a god to us because the man had done everything, and he could do everything. No less than Carroll Shelby said of Chuck Daigh, "There's only 2 people I know who can pick up a torch, can weld up a frame, make a race car, develop it, drive it, race it, and win. And the only 2 people I know who can do that are Chuck Daigh and Jack Brabham." And that's pretty high praise from Carroll Shelby because typically he kept all of his praise to himself. Chuck Daigh had quite a history in building racing Thunderbirds. And back in the early 2000 period, he had a friend and he said, "Chuck, would you build me a Thunderbird to go road racing in?" Well, you couldn't ask anyone better than Chuck Daigh to build you a racing Thunderbird because he'd been doing it for 50 years. And the advantage of this time around, the gentleman involved said, "Chuck, you and your friend Les build what you want to build, and I'll write the checks." Well, I don't think anyone could pass up a deal like that, and Chuck certainly did not. And so he sourced a original California 1957 Thunderbird, car with almost no rust on it. In fact, to this day, the car carries its original 1957 California license plate that was issued the day it was sold. The car we're looking at today debuted at the Monterey Historics in about 2007. It won the Ford Trophy as the best Ford of the entire Monterey meet. When you raise the hood and you look at this engine, it looks like a stock engine, but if you put a magnet to many of the pieces, they're not iron, they're not steel, they're aluminum. There's a few aluminum parts on this Y block that I have no idea where they came from, but there's probably not a lot of them out there. But it did take some weight off the front end, and it makes the car handle excellently. Anyway, the engine is extensively modified. It makes about 400 horsepower. And they did a lot of modifications to the car to keep it within the classification of a vintage race car. The SVRA has a class called Gold Medallion race cars, where they have to be authentic to their period. And this car is totally authentic to 1957. It runs drum brakes, although they did come from a giant Mercury land yacht station wagon because they had to fit bigger drum brakes to try to slow this thing down. It uses a Ford top loader 4-speed, Ford 9-inch rear end, and it uses a Ford Y-block V8. Now that's a big deal because there's not a lot of hot-rodded Y-blocks out there. It was a limited run engine. They quickly changed over to more modern engines. The Y-block used the same firing order as the Ford Flathead, which makes it sound different than any of the subsequent Ford V8s. When they were modifying this car for racing, they did many things to the suspension. Now, the class rules say that you can't change the pickup points and you should use stock suspension pieces. But nobody said that you couldn't take the A-arms, heat them up, torque them to a different dimension, and change the whole front end geometry and not call it stock, which is exactly what Chuck did. So the car handles and steers unlike any two-passenger bird I've ever driven. And I have driven stock two-passenger T-birds, and I can tell you, if you're blindfolded in this car, you would not guess it to be a two-passenger T-bird. The car had been raced on the West Coast pretty competitively. I got the car basically as something to just enjoy and have fun with. I like to do track days, and recently I had a chance to go to Indianapolis with Shelby American Automotive Club and run the Indianapolis road race course with them. I took the car up there, and it was a lot of fun running the course up there. Being born in Indianapolis, you know, that racetrack is kind of holy ground to a lot of us, and just being in the infield meant an awful lot to me. And actually being able to get out on track, being able to run a car up there and enjoy it, it was quite an enjoyable experience, and the car was a lot of fun. It was kind of a hit with the guys because few people have ever seen a built road racing two-passenger Thunderbird. You're used to the usual Mustangs and Cobras and those kind of cars, but the T-Bird was very unusual and definitely attracted some attention up there. We thought we'd end with a few words about the car. We had a few laps with the car. The car is a lot of fun to drive on the track. It's a very good handling car. It's got a Ford top loader 4-speed with a Hurst shifter, and so it's quite positive in shifting. And as you can see, the engine is, it's got a bit of space in front of it between the engine and the radiator where they moved the engine back to give it a little bit more rear weight balance to the car. It's without power steering. The car steers very light. It's very easy to drive. It's been a lot of places and done a lot of things. And it's a car that I respect. It's got a lot of history. Now, one of the interesting things about the Thunderbird is how it got named. Ford was trying to come up with a name for their car, and they told everybody that the grand prize would be a new suit. Now, it's kind of hard for us to believe. They said they'd buy somebody a $250 business suit if they could come up with the name of the car. Well, it turned out to be a guy in Ford marketing came up with the name Thunderbird. And I gotta say, I think that emblem and the name Thunderbird, it's a real classic. And what happened is when they took the guy out to buy him a suit, they couldn't find a suit that cost $250 in Detroit, so they had to buy him a suit and 2 pairs of pants just to use up the money. As I said, it's been fully modified for racing. It's got a roll bar, quite substantial. It does unbolt. I could, if I wanted to, take this out and I have the hard top, I have the original seats, I have the bumpers, I have basically all of the equipment that they took off of this car to modify it for racing. So if I wanted to, I could put this thing back on the street and have quite a bit of fun. We're here today at Atlanta Motorsports Park, which is a great country club racetrack. We enjoy it here. It's a very enjoyable track. And it's just good to get a car out like this and exercise it occasionally and just use it for what its intended purpose, which is go out and having a good time and making a lot of noise. So we thank you today for Steve Bush Classic Cars. We'll see you again.